boy tugged the Duke of Ashford's coat with a grip that belonged to someone twice his size.
"My mama never smiles," he said, and the words landed like a stone thrown through cathedral glass. Sudden, irreversible, and aimed at exactly the wrong man. Thomas Hale stood barely as tall as the Duke's hip, his dark curls wild from running, a carved wooden horse clutched in his free hand with the paint worn down to pale grain where his thumb had rubbed it for 2 years. He did not blink. He did not look away. He simply held the Duke's coat and waited, as though he had delivered a verdict and expected the sentencing to follow. Gabriel Ashford had been crossing the village square toward the saddler's shop, his mind full of rotting fence posts and delinquent tenants and the 1,000 small failures his dead uncle had bequeathed him along with the title. The spring air carried hawthorn blossom so thick it clung to his throat, sweet and almost cloying, and the mud beneath his boots was the soft, dark kind that meant the ground had only recently thawed. He looked down at the boy. The child's coat was clean, but mended at the elbow, his shoes scuffed, but whole. Someone was keeping him fed and clothed on very little. "She used to," Thomas added, as if this clarification changed the nature of the emergency. "Before Papa went to the angels, now she just counts things." Gabriel crouched. The movement brought him level with the boy's face, and he could see the child's eyes, dark, serious, cataloguing him with the unsettling precision of someone who had learned to read adults for weather patterns. A breeze stirred the cherry blossoms along the stone wall behind them, scattering pink petals across the square like confetti at a funeral no one had been invited to. "What does she count?" Gabriel asked, because the question arrived before he could stop it. Stitches, steps, windows. Thomas held up the wooden horse, turning it so Gabriel could see the careful carving. A mane made of tiny grooves, each one cut with a blade that knew what it was doing. "Papa made this. Mama says it's the last thing he finished." The words carried no self-pity. Children at this age did not yet know how to weaponize grief. They simply reported it, the way they reported that the sky was blue or that supper was late. Gabriel felt something shift in his chest, a tectonic movement he would not recognize until much later, as the first tremor of a commitment he had not yet made. "Where is your mama now?" Thomas pointed down the lane toward a cottage set back behind a low stone wall, where a woman sat on a wooden bench beneath an open window. Even at this distance, Gabriel could see the rigid composure of her posture, spine straight, shoulders squared, hands moving with mechanical precision over a piece of needlework stretched across her lap. The spring sunlight caught her hair, which was the color of dark honey, pinned simply and without ornament. She wore grey, not the dramatic black of fresh morning, but the exhausted grey of someone who had been grieving so long the color had simply leached out of everything she owned. She was beautiful. The realization hit Gabriel with the blunt force of a physical blow, not because he had been looking for it, but because it was so startlingly evident, even across 30 yards of muddy lane. The line of her jaw, the way her neck curved as she bent over her work, the unconscious grace of her fingers pulling thread through fabric. Beauty that did not perform. Beauty that simply existed. Like good architecture, whether anyone was watching or not. "She doesn't know I'm here," Thomas said, with the conspiratorial gravity of a 5-year-old who had committed what he considered a significant act of espionage. Gabriel stood. His knees protested. He was 30, not elderly. But the damp spring air had opinions about joints, and he looked down at the boy who had just, with the devastating efficiency of childhood honesty, made someone else's grief his problem. "What's your name?" "Thomas Hale." The boy stuck out his hand. Gabriel took it. The handshake was solemn and wildly disproportionate, the child's fingers disappearing entirely inside Gabriel's broad palm. "And your mama?" "Mrs. Hale, but her name is Eleanor." Thomas leaned closer, dropping his voice to a whisper that could have been heard across the county. "She's very clever. She reads books with no pictures." Gabriel glanced again at the cottage. Eleanor Hale had not looked up. Her hands moved, her needle flashed, and around her the spring garden was erupting into life. Green shoots pressing through dark earth, a climbing rose putting out its first tentative leaves along the wall, while she sat in the middle of it, like a woman carved from marble, untouched by the season. He did not know, standing in that square with hawthorn sweetness thick in the air and a child's carved horse still imprinted on his vision, that Eleanor Hale's husband had died at a ball. He did not know the ball had been hosted by his uncle, the previous Duke of Ashford. He did not know that the man whose title he now carried, whose debts he was paying, whose reputation he was trying to salvage, was the reason this woman had stopped smiling. He knew only that a boy had asked him for something, and that he was not the kind of man who could walk away from a child who asked. "Thomas," he said, "I think your mamma might not want a stranger interfering." "You're not a stranger." Thomas pulled the wooden horse through the air in a galloping arc. "You're the Duke! Everyone knows the Duke!" Gabriel winced. The title still sat on him like a coat made for someone else, too heavy across the shoulders, too tight in the chest. He had inherited it 7 months ago from an uncle he barely knew, a man whose parties had been legendary and whose ledgers had been catastrophic. The estate was drowning in debt, the tenants were suspicious, and the house itself, Ashford Park, a sprawling pile of limestone and bad decisions, smelled of dust and old secrets and rooms that hadn't been opened in years. "Knowing the Duke," Gabriel said carefully, "is not the same as wanting the Duke on your doorstep." Thomas considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Then he shrugged, a gesture so adult in its resignation that Gabriel almost laughed, and said, "She doesn't want anyone on her doorstep. That's the problem." The hawthorn-scented breeze shifted. Eleanor Hale's needle paused, her head tilted slightly, not toward them, but toward the sound of something Gabriel couldn't hear. A bird, perhaps, or a memory. Her fingers resumed their work. She had counted the pause, Gabriel realized. She had measured even the interruption. He had come to the village to order a new saddle. He left it with an address he had memorized, a name that tasted like something he should have known, and a boy's solemn conviction that the world's most important problem had been successfully delegated. 3 days later, Gabriel returned to the village under the pretense of inspecting the mill pond. He told himself this was estate management. The mill pond was, technically, his responsibility. The fact that his route took him past the cottage on the lane was geography, not intention. Eleanor Hale was in her garden. She knelt in the dark spring earth, pulling weeds with the focused intensity of someone conducting a military campaign against dandelions. Her sleeves were pushed to her elbows, her forearms streaked with soil, and a basket beside her held early greens, radishes, the first thin asparagus, something leafy he couldn't identify. The mud on her hands was the rich black kind that meant good soil, well tended even in grief. Thomas sat on the garden wall, swinging his legs and narrating the progress of his wooden horse across the stone surface. The horse was apparently engaged in an elaborate journey involving a dragon, a baker, and something Thomas called the incident with the pudding. Gabriel stopped at the gate. His shadow fell across the path, and Eleanor looked up. Her face was extraordinary in stillness. Not blank, far from it. Every feature was precisely controlled, each muscle held in conscious position, the way a musician holds a difficult chord. Her eyes were grey-green, the color of river water over stones, and they assessed him with a directness that made his skin prickle. She did not smile. She did not frown. She simply looked at him and waited. And the waiting had the quality of a fortress that had been under siege long enough to find the experience tedious. "Mrs. Hale." He touched his hat. I know who you are." She rose from her knees in a single fluid motion, brushing earth from her skirt with hands that did not hurry. "The new Duke of Ashford. Your fences along the North Meadow are in disrepair. Your tenants are owed a drainage ditch that was promised 3 years ago. And your mill pond," she glanced toward the lane he'd come from, "is a quarter-mile in the opposite direction." Gabriel's prepared speech, something about neighbourly concern and the general welfare of the parish, evaporated like morning frost. "You're well informed," he managed. "I live here." She picked up her basket. Radishes shifted against asparagus with a soft, earthy rustle. "When you live in a place, you notice what the people who own it neglect." The sentence landed with surgical precision. Gabriel felt it open a small, clean wound somewhere in the vicinity of his pride. She had not raised her voice. She had not inflected. She had simply stated a fact, and let the fact do the cutting. Thomas appeared at the garden wall, waving his wooden horse. "That's the Duke, Mama! I told you about him!" "You did." Eleanor's hand found her son's head, fingers moving through his curls with the automatic tenderness of long practice. She counted something. Gabriel saw her lips move, a silent enumeration, and then she looked at him again. "What do you want, Your Grace?" The question was not hostile. It was worse than hostile. It was precise. It carried the weight of a woman who had learned that men with titles wanted things, and that the wanting rarely benefited anyone but themselves. "I wanted to—" He stopped. The honest answer was, "I wanted to see if a boy was telling the truth." The polite answer was a lie he couldn't quite assemble under the direct fire of her grey-green eyes. "Your son tells me you're a needlewoman." "My son tells everyone everything." A ghost of something, not quite amusement but its distant cousin, passed across her face and vanished. "Yes, I take commissions, embroidery, mending, fine work. If you're looking for someone to repair the tapestries at Ashford Park, I should tell you I've seen them, and they're beyond saving." "You've been inside the house." "Your uncle hosted a ball." The words dropped like stones into still water. Her face did not change. Her hands did not move. But something happened behind her eyes. A door closing, a lamp being extinguished. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the flat precision of someone selecting exactly which bone to break. 2 years ago, I attended. I left. The tapestries were rotting even then." She did not say what else had happened at that ball. She did not say that her husband had gone upstairs with a group of men to play cards and had not come back down alive. She did not say that the doctor had called it apoplexy, that the convenient diagnosis had been accepted without question, that Thomas Hale, a man of 32 who could split logs and carry his son on his shoulders for miles, had supposedly collapsed from a weak heart in a room full of the Duke's guests, while his wife waited downstairs counting the minutes until he returned. She said none of this. She picked up her basket and stepped back from the gate. "Good afternoon, Your Grace." "Mrs. Hale." "The mill pond is that way." She pointed. Her arm was steady, her finger precise, and the dismissal was so complete that Gabriel felt the garden gate between them solidify into something more substantial than wood and iron. Thomas waved from the wall. "Goodbye, Duke." Gabriel walked away. The hawthorn was blooming all along the lane. Its white flowers clustered thick as lace against dark branches, and the smell of it followed him back to Ashford Park, where he stood in the entrance hall surrounded by his uncle's dust and his uncle's debts, and the lingering question of what had happened at a ball he had never attended, in a house that was now, inexplicably, his. He went to the library. It was a cold room, books lining walls that hadn't been dusted in months, windows shuttered against light that might damage spines no one was reading. Gabriel pulled open the shutters. Spring sunlight fell across the desk in a golden wash, illuminating dust motes that spun like tiny planets, and he sat down in the chair that still bore the imprint of his uncle's larger frame, and began looking through the household records for the guest list of a ball held 2 years ago. He found it at the bottom of a drawer, beneath bills of sale and a receipt for 60 bottles of champagne. The guest list was written in his uncle's secretary's cramped hand, 243 names. He ran his finger down the columns, Hail, Mr. Thomas, attendee. Hail, Mrs. Eleanor, attendee. No notes, no annotations. Just names on a list, as though the evening had been unremarkable. But a man had died, and his wife had stopped smiling, and a boy carried a wooden horse like a talisman against a grief he was too young to understand. And Gabriel sat in his uncle's cold library with hawthorn drifting through the open window, and felt the first stirring of something that was not quite suspicion and not quite guilt, but lived in the territory between them. He returned to the cottage 4 days later with a commission, a real one. He needed cushion covers for the library chairs, which had been eaten by moths and were hemorrhaging horsehair. It was a legitimate need, but it also provided a reason to stand at Eleanor Hale's gate while she examined the fabric samples he'd brought was, he told himself, coincidence operating at maximum efficiency. She met him in the garden again. Thomas was building something elaborate with sticks and stones near the wall, his wooden horse supervising from a strategic position atop a mossy rock. The afternoon was warm, the first truly warm afternoon of spring, and Eleanor had shed her grey shawl, revealing a dress of faded blue that made her eyes look less like river water and more like sea glass, smoothed by years of tumbling. Cushion covers. She took the samples from his hands without touching his fingers. The avoidance was so precise it constituted its own kind of contact, an acknowledgement that touching was a thing that existed and was being deliberately withheld. He told her they were for the library, 6 chairs, and mentioned, as though it were an afterthought, that he had been opening the shutters, that the room got good light in the afternoon. She observed, without inflection and without any visible change in expression, that the moths must appreciate it. Gabriel almost smiled. The remark was unmistakably humor, dry, compressed, arriving like a dart thrown with perfect accuracy from behind a fortification. She examined the fabric, holding each sample to the light with the professional attention of someone who knew thread counts the way a sailor knew wind speeds. Her fingers were long, calloused at the tips from years of needlework, and they moved with a certainty that made Gabriel's chest tighten for reasons he chose not to examine. She selected a deep green damask. It would hide wear and complement the walnut, and set aside a cream brocade with the brisk verdict that it would stain within a month if anyone actually sat in the chairs. When he asked whether she expected no one to sit in them, she folded the rejected sample with geometric precision and told him she expected what she had observed, that the Ashford Park Library had not been used for reading in at least a decade, that his uncle had used it for storing hunting rifles and entertaining guests who had no interest in books. The casual intimacy of her knowledge unsettled him. She seemed to know a great deal about his uncle's habits, and he said so. Her hands stilled. 1 heartbeat. 2. And he could see the rhythm of her counting in the slight movement of her lips before she resumed folding. Small villages, she told him, had long memories. He offered his Christian name, Gabriel, saying the title was only 7 months old, that he was still not used to it. The name left his mouth before his judgment could catch it. She looked at him with an assessment that was thorough, unhurried, and deeply uncomfortable, like being read by someone who understood every language you spoke, including the ones you thought were private. Then she repeated, "Your Grace," with a formality that was a wall rebuilt in real time, brick by deliberate brick, and quoted her price. A fortnight's work, 3 shillings per cover. He told her it was below the going rate. She told him she set her own rates. And when he pressed, she informed him, without heat, but with a finality that permitted no negotiation, that she would not accept charity. She would not pretend that a fair price was an unfair one to satisfy his conscience. She would not inflate her rates so that he could feel generous. 3 negations. I will not, I will not, I will not. Each one a brick in the wall she lived behind, a wall she had been building for 2 years with the same methodical precision she brought to everything, her needlework, her garden, her grief. 18 shillings for 6 covers, Gabriel said. Paid on completion. Paid on completion. She held out her hand for the deposit, A handshake to seal the bargain, and Gabriel took it. Her fingers were cool and strong and calloused, and the contact lasted exactly the duration required by commerce, and not 1 second longer. But in that second, he felt the texture of her. The roughness of labor, the steadiness of someone who held things carefully, because she knew how easily they broke. Thomas looked up from his construction project. "Are you staying for tea?" "Thomas?" Eleanor's voice carried a warning that was somehow also tender. "It's polite to offer," Thomas informed her, with the righteous confidence of a child who has recently been instructed in manners and is now wielding them like a weapon. "Your son has a point," Gabriel smiled.
My son has many points. Not all of them are relevant. But something happened at the corner of her mouth. A twitch, a tremor. The muscular memory of an expression she hadn't used in 2 years. And then it was gone. Controlled, counted, filed away. "Good afternoon, Your Grace." He left with an order placed and a handshake remembered, and the distinct, unsettling sensation. But Eleanor Hale had read his intentions more clearly than he had read them himself. Over the following week, Gabriel found reasons. The fences needed checking. The ones near her cottage first, naturally. The drainage ditch the tenants had been promised ran, by remarkable coincidence, along the edge of the lane where she walked to the village each morning. He was not following her. He was managing his estate. The fact that estate management repeatedly placed him in her vicinity was a commentary on property lines, not on his heart. He met her at the village shop on a Wednesday, where she was purchasing thread, and he was purchasing nothing in particular with tremendous conviction. She was examining a skein of silk, the color of spring leaves, holding it near the window where the light could show its true depth, and the sunlight caught the fine hairs along her forearm and turned them gold. He asked about the green thread, cushions perhaps, appearing beside her with what he hoped was casual spontaneity, and suspected was transparent desperation. She told him, without looking up, that it was for a christening gown, Mrs. Aberford's daughter, a commission she had taken before his. When he expressed surprise at the range of her work, she informed him with quiet finality that she did everything. That was what happened when you were the sole provider for a household of 2. Her fingers selected skeins with the precision of a woman who had measured and counted her way through 2 years of survival. 4, 5, 6. And she turned to the shopkeeper to place them on her account. Mr. Davies glanced at Gabriel with the expression of a man who knew exactly what was happening and was enjoying it enormously. The spring sunlight filtered through the bottle glass window, casting green and gold patterns across the wooden floor, and the shop smelled of sizing and lavender sachets, and the quiet industry of a village that conducted its business at the pace of seasons. Then she asked about the library. The question surprised Gabriel so thoroughly that he answered honestly, told her it was cold, even with the shutters open, that the fireplace drew badly and the chairs were uncomfortable, that he had been reading there every evening because it was the only room in the house that did not feel like a mausoleum. The admission came out rough and unguarded, and he watched her receive it with the focused attention of someone solving a problem they had not been asked to solve. Her fingers sorted thread with unconscious precision, blue from green, silk from cotton, and she diagnosed the issue with the certainty of an architect identifying structural failure. The flue needed sweeping. The draft came from a servant's passage behind the east wall, a door that did not seal, papered over by his uncle rather than repaired. She had noticed it at the ball. The ball. There it was again, dropped into conversation like a stone into a well, followed by silence and the long wait for impact. Gabriel asked if she had been in the library that night, and the composure that had held through every previous exchange shifted. Not anger, but something older and harder. Exhaustion, perhaps, or the particular weariness of someone who has looked for answers in every room of a house and found none of them satisfactory. She told him she had been in every room during the ball. She had been looking for her husband. The shop went quiet. Mr. Davies had developed a sudden fascination with his inventory ledger. The sunlight trembled on the floor,
and the dust motes spun in the silence. She gathered her purchases before Gabriel could respond, counted the parcels, 1, 2, 3, and left the shop with the composure of someone who had just sliced open a vein and was pretending the blood was someone else's. Gabriel stood among the bolts of fabric and the hanging skeins and the smell of sizing and lavender sachets and understood, with the clarity of someone who has just been punched in a very specific place, that Eleanor Hale's grief was not abstract. It was architectural. It had rooms and corridors and a locked chamber at its center, and the ball at Ashford Park was the key she carried, but could not turn. He went home and opened the library's east wall panel. Behind the faded wallpaper, exactly where she had said, he found a servant's door with a broken seal. Cold air streamed through the gap, carrying the smell of stone and old plaster, and the peculiar stale sweetness of rooms that had been closed too long. He also found, wedged beneath the door's lower hinge, a cufflink, silver, engraved with initials he did not recognize, T.H. Thomas Hale, the dead husband. In a passage behind the library wall, in a part of the house guests had no reason to visit, during a ball where he had supposedly been playing cards upstairs, Gabriel held the cufflink in his palm. It was cold and heavy, and it asked a question he did not yet have words for. But the question had the shape of, why was this man in this passage? And the shadow of, what happened to him here? He pocketed the cufflink. He repaired the door seal, and he sat in his uncle's library as the spring evening turned the windows to amber and gold, surrounded by books he wasn't reading, holding a dead man's silver between his fingers, and feeling the cold certainty that the house he had inherited contained rooms he had not yet opened. The cushion covers arrived on the 9th day, carried by Thomas, who delivered them with the ceremonial gravity of a herald bearing dispatches. "Mamma says the green turned out well." Thomas set the package on the library table and immediately began exploring the room with the systematic thoroughness of a 5-year-old who has been given unsupervised access to interesting territory. He ran his hands along book spines, peered into the empty fireplace, pressed his nose against the window glass where spring garden was visible, green lawn, gravel paths, the first roses putting out buds along the south wall. "She won't come in." Thomas said this without looking up from his exploration. "She says Ashford Park has enough ghosts." Gabriel opened the package. The cushion covers were immaculate, the green damask fitted and sewn, with stitches so uniform they looked mechanical, the corners precise, the finishing invisible. He ran his thumb across the fabric. This was not mere competence. This was mastery made invisible, skill so refined it erased its own effort. Gabriel crouched to the boy's level and asked about the ball, the one here 2 years ago. What did his mama say about it? Thomas stopped his exploration. His dark eyes, so like the ones that had assessed Gabriel at the garden gate, turned serious. He clutched the wooden horse, thumb finding its worn groove. "She did not talk about it," Thomas told him, with the matter-of-fact clarity of a child who has catalogued adult behavior without understanding it. She counted more after. When someone mentioned it, she counted the windows twice. 7 windows in their cottage. She counted them when she was frightened. She had counted a lot when Papa went away. She counted less when they moved to the cottage. But she still counted when something was bad. The boy delivered this intelligence without sadness or alarm, merely reporting the weather patterns of a household where grief had its own arithmetic. Gabriel's hand found the cufflink in his pocket. His fingers closed around it. The cold silver, the engraved initials, the question it embodied. He asked if the boy's mama was frightened of this house. Thomas thought about this with genuine concentration, his brow furrowed, and then said something that landed with the weight of a commission heavier than cushion covers and more binding than commerce. She was frightened, he said, of what had happened in it. Then he looked at Gabriel with an expression far too old for his face. and asked if Gabriel was going to find out what happened. Gabriel looked at this boy, this child, holding a dead man's carved horse in a dead man's duke's library, and felt the ground shift beneath the careful fiction that he was here about upholstery. "Yes," he said, and the word felt like the first honest thing he'd spoken in this house. Thomas nodded, satisfied, and asked to play in the garden. Gabriel told him he could play wherever he liked. The boy vanished through the library door with the velocity of a cannonball. Gabriel heard his footsteps recede down the corridor, heard the heavy front door open and close, heard, faintly through the window, the sound of a child making galloping noises across a gravel path. He sat down at his uncle's desk and began, methodically, to search for records of the ball. What he found, over the following days, assembled itself like a mosaic viewed from increasing distance, meaningless fragments that resolved, piece by piece, into a picture he did not want to see. His uncle's correspondence, stuffed into desk drawers with the organizational philosophy of a man who believed paperwork was beneath him, contained references to a card game. Not cards in the drawing room, where the guests played whist for shillings. Cards in the private study, upstairs, where the stakes were different. A letter from a solicitor, dated 3 weeks after the ball. "The matter of Mr. Hale's debt is, as you know, complicated by his unfortunate passing. Mrs. Hale disputes the amount and refuses to acknowledge the vows. I advise discretion." Debt. Vows. A card game with a dead man's markers. Gabriel spread the letters across the desk. The library was warm now. He'd had the flue swept, the door sealed, a fire laid, and the spring evening painted the room in shades of honey and amber. He could smell hawthorn through the open window, and somewhere in the garden Thomas was playing, his small voice carrying fragments of invented narrative through the twilight. A knock at the library door. His housekeeper, Mrs. Marsh, a woman whose loyalty to Ashford Park predated 3 dukes and whose disapproval could curdle cream at 20 paces. "Mrs. Hale is at the door, Your Grace. She says her son was meant to deliver covers and return immediately." The pause that followed contained an entire commentary. That was 4 hours ago. Gabriel gathered the letters into the desk drawer, closed it, and went to the entrance hall. Eleanor stood in the doorway. The evening light was behind her, turning her silhouette sharp and her expression unreadable. She wore the grey dress, always grey, and her hands were clasped at her waist with the controlled tension of someone preventing themselves from making fists. "Thomas." Her voice carried the particular restraint of a mother whose child has been missing long enough to convert worry into fury. "Where is he?" "In the garden. He's been playing, safely, for several hours. I should have sent word." "Yes." The single syllable contained an assessment, a verdict, and a sentence. "You should have." "Mama!" Thomas materialized from the darkness of the garden, wooden horse held aloft, face flushed with the particular joy of a child who has had an unexpectedly excellent afternoon. "The Duke has a pond, with actual fish!" Eleanor's hands unclenched. She crouched, caught her son, pulled him against her with a fierceness that made Gabriel step back. Her eyes closed. Her lips moved, counting, he knew now. Counting heartbeats or breaths, or the specific number of seconds required for the panic to recede. 4, she whispered. 4 hours, Thomas. I was playing. I know. She stood, lifting him to her hip with the practiced ease of a woman who had been carrying this weight, all of it, every kind of it, alone. Her eyes met Gabriel's over her son's dark curls, and what he saw there was not anger. It was something far more dangerous. It was the look of a woman who had lost one person in this house and would not, could not, lose another. Gabriel apologized, genuinely. She shifted Thomas on her hip, the boy already drowsy, his head dropping to her shoulder, the wooden horse dangling from slack fingers, and told him that words were easy. She had found, she said, that men with titles apologized beautifully and changed nothing. The observation landed with surgical precision, and Gabriel felt it open the same small wound she had opened in the garden weeks ago, when she had told him his fences were in disrepair. He told her to come back tomorrow, to bring Thomas. He would show her what he had found. Her stillness intensified, the particular quality of someone who has heard something unexpected and is calculating its implications at speed. She asked what he had found, and he told her, in the library, about the ball, about her husband. The cufflink was in his pocket, and the letters were in his desk, and the question was in the air between them. The evening went very quiet. The hawthorn breathed its sweetness into the space between them. Thomas slept on his mother's shoulder, his small body rising and falling with her controlled breaths. And Eleanor Hale stood in the doorway of the house where her husband had died, and looked at the man who had inherited it with an expression that was not hope. She had burned through hope 2 years ago, but was something adjacent to it. Curiosity, perhaps, or the particular alertness of someone who has been counting days and has just been told the number might mean something after all. "Tomorrow," she said, after Thomas's lessons. He offered to have tea prepared. She turned, and the gravel crunched under her shoes. Each step measured, counted, precise, and told him she did not want his tea. She wanted the truth about what happened to her husband in his house. She walked away into the spring twilight with her sleeping son and her unanswered questions, and the carved wooden horse swinging gently from the boy's dreaming hand. Gabriel watched until the darkness and the hawthorn swallowed them both, and then he went back to the library and sat among his uncle's papers, and began to understand that the house he had inherited was not merely neglected. It was guilty. She arrived at 2:30, alone. Thomas was with the vicar's wife, who gave him lessons in letters and sums, and tolerated his wooden horse's participation in both subjects. Eleanor wore the grey dress. Was there another? Gabriel wondered. And her hair was pinned with the same severe simplicity, and she carried herself through the entrance hall of Ashford Park with the controlled precision of someone walking into a room where a bomb might be hidden. Gabriel led her to the library. She paused at the door. He watched her count the windows, he thought, or the books, or the paces between the door and the desk. And then she entered with the deliberate footfall of someone who has decided that retreat is no longer an option. "You've changed it." She looked at the fire, the swept hearth, the open shutters, the new green cushions on the chairs. "It was colder before, and darker. It was a room designed to keep people out. I'm trying to make it a room that lets people in." She sat, not in the cushioned chairs, on the straight-backed wooden chair by the desk, as if comfort were a concession she was not prepared to make. Her hands folded in her lap. She counted the folds. Gabriel saw her fingers move. 1, 2, 3. And then she looked at him with the grey-green eyes that missed nothing. "Show me." He placed the cufflink on the desk between them. Silver. Eleanor's breath caught. It was the first uncontrolled sound he had heard her make, a small, sharp intake that sounded like paper tearing. Her hand reached for it, stopped, hovered. Her fingers trembled. She counted. He could see the effort of it, the lips moving, the deliberate imposition of order on a body that wanted to collapse. She asked where he had found it, her voice steady, her hands not. He told her, behind the library wall, in a servant's passage concealed by wallpaper, the cufflink wedged beneath the hinge. She picked it up. Her thumb traced the initials the way Thomas's thumb traced the mane of the wooden horse, with the same worn, repetitive devotion to an object that connected the living to the dead. She closed her eyes. Her lips moved. 7. The number of windows in her cottage. The number that meant safety. When her eyes opened, she told him her husband had been wearing both cufflinks at the ball. He had kissed her before he went upstairs, and she had felt the cuff against her wrist. She set the cufflink down with the precision of someone placing a chess piece, and asked the question that had been forming since she first saw the silver on the desk. He was supposed to have been playing cards in the drawing room. Why was he in a servant's passage? Gabriel sat across from her. The desk between them was wide and polished, and held, in its drawers, the letters he was about to show her. He did not know, he admitted, but he had found more. He laid out the correspondence. The solicitor's letter about disputed debts, a note in his uncle's hand, cramped, hasty, written after midnight, referencing the Hale situation and recommending silence as the most prudent course. A receipt for a payment made to the doctor who had signed the death certificate. Eleanor read each document with the focused stillness of a woman who had been asking questions for 2 years and was finally receiving answers. Her finger traced lines, paused, moved on. She did not cry. She did not exclaim. She simply absorbed, and the absorption had the quality of a rising tide, quiet, inevitable, and capable of enormous force. She looked up from the solicitor's letter with the expression of someone who has found the keystone and knows the entire arch is about to shift. His uncle had paid Dr. Melford, she said, 50 guineas for a death certificate that said apoplexy. Her voice was level, but her hands had found each other, fingers interlocking, knuckles white. Her husband had been 32. He could carry Thomas on his shoulders for 3 miles without stopping. He had not died of a weak heart. Gabriel met her eyes and confirmed it. He did not believe he had. The silence that followed was not empty. It was crowded, with implications, with grief reshaping itself from sorrow into something sharper, with the terrible gravity of a suspicion confirmed. She asked him why he was showing her this. The question was pure steel rose, not grateful, not relieved, but precise, interrogative, weapon drawn. Gabriel leaned forward, his broad palms pressing flat into the polished desk, and told her the truth as plainly as he could. Because it had happened in his house, under his family's roof. Because he would not inherit a title and ignore what it cost. She studied him. The assessment lasted long enough that Gabriel felt it in his muscles, a physical examination conducted entirely through eye contact. She was looking for the lie. She was looking for the angle, the self-interest, the manipulation that her experience told her must be present, because men with power always wanted something. She asked what he wanted. The same question from the garden gate, the same precision, and then asked why. Because your son carries a wooden horse like a prayer. Because you count windows when you're frightened. Because a man died here, and someone paid to make it look natural. And I am not. His hands pressed harder into the wood, knuckles whitening to match hers. I am not my uncle. I will not be his silence. Eleanor's chin lifted. The movement was small, a fraction of an inch, but it changed the architecture of her face, shifting it from assessment to something that might, under very specific conditions, eventually become alliance. If I help you, she said, it is not because I trust you. It is because I have been looking for 2 years, and I am tired of looking alone. Understood. And if I discover that you knew, that any part of you knew what your family did, I will take my son and leave, and you will never find either of us again. Also understood. She held out her hand, the same handshake as before. Commerce, contract, terms agreed. Gabriel took it. Her fingers were cool and calloused, and this time she did not pull away immediately. She held on for 1 beat longer than necessary. Not warmth, not affection, but something that lived in the space where trust might eventually be constructed. The card game, she said, releasing his hand. Start with the card game. Thomas was invited to play by Lord Brathwaite, your uncle's closest friend. I want to know who else was at that table. I'll find the records, and I'll tell you what I know. She straightened in her chair. I have spent 2 years asking questions in this village. I know which servants were dismissed after the ball. I know which debts were quietly settled. I know the name of every man who went upstairs that night." She began to speak, and Gabriel listened, and the library, that had been cold and dark and full of secrets, began, slowly, to become a room where those secrets were examined in good light. They worked through the afternoon. Eleanor produced, from a leather wallet she carried in her skirt pocket, a folded sheet of paper, covered in her precise handwriting. Names, dates, amounts, questions. She had been investigating for 2 years, alone, with nothing but a widow's determination and a village's reluctant whispers. What she had assembled was not proof. It was the architecture of proof. The scaffolding that showed where the building stood, even though the building itself had been torn down. Thomas Hale had gone upstairs at 11 o'clock on the night of the ball. Lord Brathwaite had invited him to a private card game, high stakes, gentlemen only. 2 other men had been present, Sir Marcus Fell, and a man Eleanor knew only as Mr. Blackwood. By midnight, Thomas Hale was dead. By morning, the doctor had signed the certificate, the body had been removed, and Lord Brathwaite had left for London on the first coach. Eleanor pressed her finger against the solicitor's letter and walked him through what she had pieced together. The solicitor claimed Thomas had owed money, card debts, vowels, but Thomas had not gambled. He had hated cards. Her jaw tightened as she said it. Someone had constructed a debt to explain why he was upstairs, to make it seem as though he had chosen to be there. Gabriel pointed out that the doctor's payment, 50 guineas, represented a year's income for a country physician. A year's income, she told him, was the price of a lie. And for the first time, he saw behind the composure, the exhaustion, the fury, the 2 years of grief compounded by the knowledge that grief was not enough, that someone owed her more than grief, that someone owed her the truth. They agreed they needed to find Blackwood. Eleanor stood, and the afternoon had darkened while they worked, spring clouds moving in from the west, the library's warm light suddenly precious against the grey pressing at the windows. She needed to collect Thomas, she said, and moved toward the door. She paused at the threshold, turned. The library's firelight caught the line of her jaw, the curve of her neck, the particular way her hair escaped its pins at the temple. She was beautiful in this light, fierce and weary and undefeated, and Gabriel felt something lurch in his chest that he recognized as dangerous, and did nothing to prevent. She told him she would come tomorrow, that she would bring the household accounts from the week after the ball. 3 servants had been dismissed. All 3 had received severance pay tripled the normal amount. Silence money, Gabriel thought, and the phrase settled in the room like a verdict. She observed, almost smiling, the muscles engaging, the corners lifting a fraction before the expression was captured, counted, controlled, that silence was expensive. But he had seen the ghost of the smile, the ghost of the woman she had been before grief had taught her to count everything, trust nothing, and lock every smile in a room she no longer visited. She offered her Christian name as she left, Eleanor, saying that if they were investigating a death together, formality seemed excessive. The name arrived quietly, like a door being left unlocked rather than opened. Gabriel tested it. It sat in his mouth like something valuable, a word that cost something to give and something to receive. She left. The library smelled of hawthorn and old paper, and the particular warmth of a fire that has burned for hours in a room that had been cold for years. Gabriel sat in the green cushioned chair she had refused to use and held the cufflink, and thought about a woman who counted windows, and a boy who carried a wooden horse, and a question that was growing larger with every answer they found. They fell into a pattern. Eleanor came to the library every afternoon while Thomas had his lessons. She brought her documents, her lists, her questions. Gabriel brought his uncle's correspondence, his household records, his growing certainty that the man whose title he carried had been, at best, complicit in a terrible wrong. They worked across the desk, she on one side, he on the other, papers spread between them like a country where the borders were still being drawn. She was methodical. He was intuitive. She found patterns in numbers, The amounts didn't add up. The timing was too convenient. The payments stopped exactly when the questions did. He found patterns in behavior. Why this servant was dismissed. Why that door was sealed. Why the entire east wing had been closed after the ball and never reopened. He told her one afternoon, watching her cross-reference two ledgers with the speed of someone born toward it, that she thought like a magistrate. She did not look up. She thought, she told him, like a woman who had been lied to. Liars left tracks. You simply had to know what you were looking for. And what she was looking for was a name. The last man who had been in the room when Thomas died. His uncle was dead. Brathwaite was in London and would not receive her letters.
Fell had died the previous winter. Convenient, since he had been the most likely to talk. Blackwood was the last thread. Gabriel offered to write to London. The title sat on his tongue like a coin he had not yet spent. He had access, he said, to resources his uncle had never used for anything useful. Eleanor heard the word resources and recognized it for what it was. He meant power. He meant the ability to make inquiries that a widow could not. Her chin lifted, and she informed him, her voice steady, precise, devastating, that she had made inquiries a duke would never think to make. She had spoken to laundresses, stable boys, kitchen maids. She knew what had been served at that card game. She knew the servants had heard raised voices after midnight. She knew that someone had left through the servants' passage, the same passage where he had found the cufflink, at approximately 1 in the morning. There was one witness she had not reached, a Mrs. Cooper, a former housemaid, who shut her door each time Eleanor knocked. The woman was afraid, Eleanor said, her voice flat with the frustration of someone who understood fear and resented it anyway. Afraid of what Brathwaite's money had bought, and unwilling to break that contract for a widow with no authority behind her. She had not needed a title for any of it, except perhaps for that one locked door. Gabriel held her gaze and acknowledged it. She had not needed one. He was not suggesting she had. He was suggesting that together they might find what neither of them could find alone. The word together landed between them. Eleanor's hands stilled on the ledger. She counted. He saw the rhythm, the lips moving, the familiar ritual of self-regulation. And when she looked at him again, something in her expression had shifted. Not softened, realigned. She would work with him, she said, but with conditions. She laid them out with the precision of a woman drafting terms of surrender, though in this case, it was alliance. She would see every document, every letter, every response. He would not decide what she needed to know. Thomas would never be involved. He would not hear conversations about his father's death, would not see the evidence. He knew Papa had gone to the angels, and that was sufficient. And when they found the truth, when, not if, she would decide what happened with it, not him. Gabriel agreed to each condition as it arrived, and he understood that they were not requests. They were the terms of a woman who had learned, through 2 years of trying to be heard while the world insisted on her silence, that control was not given. It was taken, held, and defended. "One more thing," she said. "I will not come to this house on the anniversary. April 27th. That is mine." April 27th, Gabriel repeated. It was 12 days away. The ball had been on April 27th, 2 years ago. The night her husband went upstairs and did not come back. The night she counted minutes in the ballroom, waiting, while something happened in the rooms above her that would remove her smile, like a surgeon removing a nerve. 12 days, she said, and he heard her count them, the weight of each one, the particular density of time when it carries a memory that cuts. She left. The library was warm and alive with their afternoon's work. Papers spread, tea growing cold, the green cushions bearing the impression of Gabriel's weight, where he sat reading while she paced and catalogued and built her case. It was, he realized, the first time this room had felt like something other than a mausoleum.
She had brought life into it, simply by refusing to let death have the last word. Thomas appeared at the library door the next morning, wooden horse in hand, face radiant with the particular joy of a Saturday without lessons.
Mama says I can play in the garden while she works with you.
She's here.
She's counting your roses.
Thomas disappeared into the corridor. His voice echoed back. She says they need pruning. Gabriel found Eleanor in the garden, examining the rose beds with the critical eye of a woman who understood that neglect in April meant disaster in July. The morning was bright and warm, the first truly warm morning of spring, and she had, for the first time, shed the grey. She wore a dress of pale blue, faded but clean, and the change was startling. She looked less like a monument to grief, and more like a woman standing in a garden in spring, alive, present, noticing the colour of things. "Your gardener is incompetent," she said by way of greeting.
I don't have a gardener.
That explains the roses. She crouched by a bush, her fingers finding the dead wood with professional certainty.
This one could be saved. These two are beyond help. This one...
She paused, her hand on a branch that had put out a single green shoot, impossibly bright against the grey wood.
This one is trying.
Gabriel crouched beside her. The proximity was closer than they had ever been, close enough to smell her, which was not perfume, but soap and garden earth, and the clean, honest smell of someone who worked with their hands. Her breath moved the fine hairs at her temple. You could see the faint line of a scar below her left ear, nearly invisible, the kind that came from a childhood fall and stayed forever. "Let it try," he said, and meant something else entirely. She looked at him. The distance between their faces was measured in inches and in years. Years of her grief, years of his ignorance. The space between a woman who had been lied to and a man whose family had done the lying. Her eyes held his, grey-green and searching, and Gabriel felt the moment stretch and thin and become something that could not be taken back. "The shoot is strong," she said, looking at the rose, "but the rootstock is old. It needs support." "Then we'll support it." She stood. The moment, whatever it had been, was counted, catalogued, filed, but not discarded. He could see that in the way she did not immediately step back, in the way her hand brushed the rose's new leaf as she straightened, in the way she turned to watch Thomas galloping across the lawn with his wooden horse, and let her eyes stay soft for 3 full seconds before the composure returned. She reasserted business then, the East Wing. He had said it was closed since the ball. Sealed, he confirmed. His uncle had the doors locked and the keys removed. She said they needed the keys, and the statement had the force of an order given by someone accustomed to being the only strategist in the room. They spent the morning searching the house. Thomas played in the garden, safely visible through every window they passed, his voice carrying fragments of horse narrative through the spring air. Eleanor moved through Ashford Park with the controlled focus of someone revisiting a crime scene, touching walls, counting doors, noting details Gabriel had walked past 100 times without seeing. She stopped at the end of the east corridor and identified the door, papered over with wallpaper that almost matched the surrounding wall. Almost. This was the card room, she told him. His uncle had sealed it. Gabriel pressed his palm against the wallpaper. Beneath it, the door was solid oak, and the lock, when he peeled back the paper, an act that felt like peeling back a lie, was heavy brass, untouched by 2 years of concealment. He said he would have it opened, but Eleanor's hand found his arm before he could step back. The touch was brief, purposeful, and searing. Her calloused fingers on his forearm, pressure and release, a physical comma in the sentence of their investigation. "Not yet," she told him. They needed to know what they were looking for before they opened it. If someone had cleaned that room, they had been thorough. But if they had sealed it instead of cleaning it, then something was still in there that could not be removed. She let go of his arm. Her hand returned to her side and counted. He saw the fingers move, thumb touching each fingertip in sequence, a private rosary of self-control. She would bring what she had gathered from the servants' accounts tomorrow. They would know what had been moved and what had not. They opened the door on a Thursday. Gabriel had the lock picked by a locksmith from the neighboring town, not the local one, at Eleanor's insistence, because local men have local loyalties, and your uncle's reach did not die with him. The room exhaled when the door opened. 2 years of sealed air, smelling of dust and cold plaster, and something else. Something fainter, darker, the olfactory ghost of candle smoke and spilled wine, and a night that had gone wrong. The card table was still set. 4 chairs, 4 glasses, 1 overturned. A scatter of cards, not in play formation but thrown, dropped, abandoned in haste. Eleanor stepped inside. She moved to the table with the careful precision of a woman walking across ice. Her fingers hovered above the cards, not touching.
4 glasses. She counted them. 4 chairs. Brathwaite, Fell, Blackwood, Thomas.
Her finger traced the air above the overturned glass. This was Thomas's seat. He was left-handed. The glass is positioned to the left. Gabriel watched her work. She was magnificent in her focus. Every movement deliberate, every observation precise. Her grief transmuted into the cold fire of investigation. This was the steel rose at full bloom, composed, devastating, and conducting a 2-year reckoning in the room where it began. There! She pointed to the floor near the fireplace. A dark stain, not large, but unmistakable against the pale stone. That isn't wine. Gabriel crouched. The stain was brown with age, roughly the size of his palm, and it marked the stone with the permanence of something that had soaked in before anyone thought to clean it. They sealed the room instead of cleaning it, Eleanor said. Her voice was absolutely steady. Her hands, clasped at her waist, were white-knuckled. Because the stain wouldn't come out. Because whatever happened here left a mark they couldn't remove. Eleanor, he hit his head. She was counting now, lips moving, eyes fixed on the stain, the ritual working overtime to hold together what was threatening to come apart. Someone, whatever happened during that card game, Thomas hit his head on the hearthstone. The doctor wrote apoplexy, but it was a blow, a fall, something that split the skin and left a mark on the floor. And they called it a weak heart and sent me home with a body and a lie. The room was very quiet. Spring light fell through the dusty window, catching motes that spun in the disturbed air. And outside, Thomas's voice rose in cheerful narrative about his wooden horse's latest adventure, sweet and oblivious and safe. I'm sorry. Gabriel's voice came out rough, the words abraded by the weight of an apology that could not possibly be adequate. Eleanor, I am sorry. Don't. She held up one hand. Don't apologize for something you didn't do. Find out who did. She turned and walked out of the room. Her steps were measured. He counted them himself, hearing the rhythm she imposed on her own feet, the discipline of a woman who refused to run from anything, even the room where her husband had died. 7 steps to the corridor. 7, like the windows in her cottage, the number that meant safety. Gabriel stood alone in the card room, with its set table and its overturned glass and its stain on the hearthstone, and felt the full weight of inheritance. Not money, not title, not property, but the accumulated consequence of what his family had done and hidden and sealed behind a door and hoped the world would forget. He locked the room, not to conceal it, to preserve it. Evidence. The words sat in his mind with a new and terrible clarity. That evening, he wrote to London. 2 letters. One to a solicitor he trusted, requesting information on a Mr. Blackwood connected to Lord Brathwaite's circle. Another to Brathwaite himself. Formal, precise. The kind of letter that made clear the new Duke was not his uncle, and that silence was no longer a viable strategy. He posted the letters at dawn. The hawthorn along the lane was at its peak now, every branch heavy with white blossom. The scent so thick, it seemed to have weight and texture. And Gabriel walked through it, thinking about a woman who counted 7 windows, and a room that had been sealed for 2 years, and the growing, inescapable certainty that making Eleanor Hale smile again meant first making her weep. With the relief of truth, if not with the comfort of justice. Eleanor arrived the next afternoon with a basket. Thomas was behind her, wooden horse in one hand, a biscuit in the other, both receiving equal attention. She set the basket on the library desk between a stack of ledgers and a pile of correspondence and told him, with the blunt authority of a woman who had kept a household alive on very little, that if they were going to work, they should eat. He looked, she informed him, like he had not slept. He admitted he had not. She unpacked the basket without further commentary. Bread, cheese, early radishes from her garden, a pot of something that smelled of honey and lemon, her hands moving with the efficient precision of someone who had been feeding people on very little for long enough to make it look effortless. She ordered Thomas to wash his hands. Thomas protested their cleanliness. She observed that they were holding a biscuit and a horse and repeated the instruction. Thomas departed with the martyred sigh of a child who has been grievously wronged by hygiene. Eleanor watched him go, counted his footsteps, 7 to the corridor, and then turned to Gabriel with an expression that was, for the first time, not assessment. It was concern. She said he had read the letters, not a question. All of them. Everything in the desk, the study, the estate office. He rubbed his face. His jaw was rough with overnight stubble, and his shoulders ached from hunching over documents in the library, despite its warmth, felt close and heavy with what he'd learned. My uncle was not a good man, Eleanor. I know. No, you know he was complicit. What I found, the extent of it. He stopped, drew a breath. The card game was rigged. Brathwaite and your uncle, my uncle, they ran it as a scheme. Wealthy men with debts, invited to a private game where the stakes were controlled and the outcomes predetermined. Your husband was targeted because he had just inherited his father's land. They wanted the property. Eleanor sat. This time, she chose the cushioned chair, the green one by the fire, and the choice felt significant. She was no longer a visitor conducting business at a desk. She was a partner, settling in for a long conversation in a room that had become, against all probability, theirs. The land, she said. Her voice went flat. Of course, the 30 acres along the river. She knew about it. Her Thomas, her husband, had received it 3 months before the ball. His father's estate. It bordered Ashford Park. Her counting fingers moved, thumb to forefinger, forefinger to middle, the rosary of self-control. His uncle had wanted that land, she told him, had tried to buy it from her father-in-law for years. And when her husband inherited it, he had been invited to a card game, where he was given debts he did not incur, in a room where he conveniently died, and the land became available at auction 6 months later. His uncle bought it, at a fraction of its value. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Gabriel had ever heard. It contained 2 years of grief reorganizing itself around a new axis. Not sorrow, but fury. Eleanor Hale's composure did not break. It hardened. Her spine straightened, her chin lifted. Her eyes, grey-green and luminous in the firelight, took on the quality of a blade being drawn from a sheath. She told him she wanted the land back. Gabriel said it was hers. She blinked, the only visible sign of surprise, a single interruption in the rhythm of her counting, a fraction of a second where the composure flickered and something raw showed through. He owned it, he explained. It had come with the estate. He would sign it over tomorrow. She told him she had not asked for charity. He told her it was not charity. It was restitution. The land had been stolen. He was returning it. She asked if there were conditions, without strings, without anything owed. He leaned forward, forearms on his knees, and looked at her with the particular directness of a man who has decided that honesty is the only currency that matters. Eleanor, my family took your husband. They took your land. They took your smile. I cannot undo the first. I am undoing the second. The third. He stopped. His hands opened, palms up, empty and honest and very large. The third isn't mine to give or take. It's yours. Thomas returned, hands ostentatiously clean, and climbed into the chair beside his mother. He leaned against her shoulder, wooden horse positioned on the arm of the chair, and looked at Gabriel with the unblinking assessment of a child who understands more than adults believe.
Are you making Mama sad again?
No, Eleanor said, and her voice was strange, thicker, less controlled, as though the precise mechanism that governed her speech had loosened by a single degree. He's making me angry. That's different. Is angry better than sad? She looked down at her son. Her hand found his curls, moved through them with the tenderness that was the one thing she never controlled, never counted, never measured. The hawthorn-scented breeze moved through the open library window, carrying the particular warmth of a spring afternoon that had decided to be generous. Yes, she said. Angry is much better than sad. Gabriel watched them, the woman and the boy, her fierce composure and his innocent gravity, the carved horse standing sentinel on the chair arm, and felt the ground shift again beneath him. The tectonic movement that had begun in the village square when a boy tugged his coat and stated an impossible problem. He was falling. He knew it. The knowledge arrived not as a revelation, but as a recognition, the way you recognize a landscape you've seen in a painting before visiting in person. He had been fawning since the garden, since the handshake, since she told him his fences were in disrepair, with the devastating precision of a woman who noticed everything and forgave nothing. He was falling, and she was counting, and somewhere between his descent and her arithmetic, a story was being written that neither of them had planned. The letter from Brathwaite arrived on the 25th of April, 2 days before the anniversary. Gabriel opened it in the library, where the afternoon light fell warm and golden across the desk, and Eleanor's empty chair waited by the fire, and the words on the paper turned the warmth to ice. Your uncle's debts are your debts, Ashford. The arrangement was mutual. If you pursue this matter, I will ensure that the circumstances of Mr. Hale's death are reframed in ways you will find professionally and personally devastating. Blackwood is my man. He will say what I tell him to say. Drop this, or I will destroy you before you destroy me. Gabriel read the letter twice, 3 times. His hands, which could bend a horseshoe and lift a loaded saddle one-handed, trembled with the particular vibration of fury held under extreme control. Blackwood was lost to them. Brathwaite's man, bought and scripted, a witness who would testify to whatever version his master required. The last thread Eleanor had been chasing for 2 years had just been cut. But the letter's very desperation pointed Gabriel toward a different thread, the one Eleanor had identified weeks ago. The housemaid who would not open her door for a widow. A duke, however, was a different matter. He did not show Eleanor the letter. Not because he was hiding it, he would show her everything he had promised, but because the anniversary was 2 days away, and she had asked for that day, and he would not load her with his enemy's threats when she was already carrying the weight of memory. Instead, he went to the village. He found Mr. Davies at the shop, who confirmed Mrs. Cooper's address, the former housemaid Eleanor had tried and failed to reach. Mrs. Cooper was 72, hard of hearing, and possessed of the particular moral clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose. She sat in her cottage kitchen, a cup of tea in spotted hands, and looked at Gabriel with the sharp eyes of a woman who had been carrying a secret for 2 years and was tired of the weight. She had wondered, she told him, when someone would come to ask. His uncle had told them not to speak of it, paid them well not to. But money did not buy silence. It rented it. And the lease had expired. She told him everything. The card game, the argument. Thomas Hale had discovered the game was fixed, had accused Braithwaite, had stood and thrown his cards and declared he was leaving to fetch the magistrate. The scuffle. Braithwaite's push, not hard, not intended to kill, but aimed at a man standing too close to a stone hearth. The fall, the crack, the silence that followed, thick and terrible and permanent. It had been an accident, she said, setting down her teacup with the decisive click of a woman delivering testimony, that became a crime when they covered it up. His uncle had paid the doctor. Braithwaite had paid the servants. And that poor woman downstairs, counting the minutes, waiting for a husband who was already gone. Mrs. Cooper stopped there. Even after 2 years, the memory had weight. Gabriel asked her to write it down, everything she had told him. He would bring a solicitor. Mrs. Cooper straightened, and in the gesture Gabriel saw a ghost of Eleanor's composure, a different generation's version of the same refusal to be broken. She told him she would write it herself. She had been writing it for 2 years, she said, waiting for someone who deserved to read it. He left her cottage with a promise and a date, the 28th, after the anniversary, after Eleanor had survived another April 27th, after the counting had reached its annual peak and begun, slowly, to subside. The anniversary passed. Gabriel stayed away from the cottage, as she had asked. He spent the day in the library, reading his uncle's letters and mapping the network of complicity that had turned a man's death into a line item in a household budget. The hawthorn was beginning to fade now, the first petals falling, white as paper, collecting in the corners of the windowsills, and the spring was tipping toward a warmer, fuller season. Thomas appeared at the library window the next morning, face pressed against the glass, breath fogging a circle around his nose. His voice came through muffled, but brutally clear. His mamma had cried yesterday. She had counted all the windows 3 times. Then she had cried. Then she had made him supper and read him a story, and cried again when she thought he was asleep. The boy delivered this report with the solemn precision of a child who has observed something important and does not yet understand why it hurts to say it aloud. Gabriel opened the window. Thomas's face was serious, his wooden horse held tight. Gabriel asked if she was all right today. Thomas considered the question with genuine care and reported that she was cross. Cross, he decided, was better than crying. Gabriel smiled at the boy, despite the ache in his chest, and agreed. Much better. Thomas relayed the final piece of his dispatch. His mamma was coming at 2 o'clock, and Gabriel should have the solicitor's letter ready. Eleanor arrived at 2. She was wearing the grey again, appropriate for the day after an anniversary. But her hair was different, looser, less pinned, less controlled, as though the previous day's grief had exhausted even her capacity for discipline, and she had rebuilt herself this morning with slightly less scaffolding. She walked into the library, saw the letter from Braithwaite on the desk, where Gabriel had left it in plain sight, picked it up, and read it standing. Her voice was steady as she read. He was threatening him, she said. Gabriel corrected her, threatening them. She set the letter down and disagreed with the flat authority of a woman who had already lost everything worth threatening. He was threatening Gabriel. She had nothing left for Braithwaite to take. She looked at him with the particular clarity of someone who has passed through the worst and found, on the other side, a landscape that holds no more fear, and asked what he had done about it. He told her. Mrs. Cooper, the written testimony, the solicitor from London arriving next week, the evidence they had assembled, the cufflink, the sealed room, the stain on the hearth, the payments, the letters. The case was circumstantial but damning, and Braithwaite's letter was, itself, an admission that there was something to conceal. Eleanor listened. She sat in the green chair, her chair now, by unspoken agreement, and her hands rested in her lap without counting. The stillness was different today. Not the controlled stillness of a woman holding herself together, but the quieter stillness of someone whose pieces had been rearranged by grief and anger, and the slow, tentative work of being believed. Then she told him about the spring assembly, a ball in 10 days where the county gathered and where Brathwaite would certainly appear. He never missed the social season. If they presented the evidence publicly, she began, and Gabriel tried to stop her. A ball was where her husband had died. She knew exactly what had happened at a ball. Her voice did not rise. It dropped. Lower. Harder. The frequency of a blade being sharpened. She would not let a ball be the end of this story. She would make it the end of his. Gabriel looked at her. This woman who had lost her husband at a ball and was choosing to fight at one, who had spent 2 years counting and was now choosing to stop, who had been silent and was now choosing to speak, and felt the last, thin barrier between admiration and love dissolve like sugar in warm water. He mentioned, carefully, that she would need a dress, something other than grey. She stood and told him she had a dress, the one she had worn to his uncle's ball, the last thing she owned that her husband had ever seen her in. She would wear it because she wanted to, she told him, not because he wanted her to, not because the occasion demanded it. She moved toward the door, and in the movement Gabriel saw the grace, the deliberate beauty she had been hiding under grief for 2 years, the instinctive precision of a dancer who walks without an audience, owing nothing to performance and everything to the body's own memory of elegance. At the threshold she paused and used his name, Gabriel, for the second time, and the word carried more weight than before. A door not just unlocked, but opened a fraction of an inch. If he danced with her at the assembly, she told him, she would expect him to keep up. She left. The library was warm and bright and alive, and the green chair held the ghost of her presence. And Gabriel stood in the middle of a room that his uncle had used to store rifles, and thought about a woman who was choosing to fight, and felt, for the first time since inheriting a title he hadn't wanted and a house full of secrets he hadn't known, that the fight might be worth winning. The spring assembly was held at the Mercer Rooms in the market town, 3 miles from Ashford Park. The evening was soft and warm, late April tipping into May, the air carrying the last of the hawthorn and the first of the wild roses. The sky still light at 8 o'clock, with the long, generous dusk of an English spring. Gabriel arrived in his uncle's carriage, which he had cleaned and which still smelled faintly of the previous Duke's cigars, despite his best efforts. He wore black, not morning black, but the sharp, deliberate black of a man who intended to be noticed. His shoulders filled the doorway of the Mercer Rooms, and he felt the crowd's attention shift the way iron filings shift near a magnet, every head turning, every conversation adjusting. He scanned the room. Braithwaite was already there, a large man, florid, with the particular confidence of someone who has never been seriously challenged. He stood by the punch bowl, holding court, and when he saw Gabriel, his smile tightened by exactly the amount that confirmed every suspicion. And then Eleanor arrived. She wore blue, not the faded blue of her cottage dress, but a deep, luminous sapphire that caught the candlelight and held it. A gown that had been made for a different life, cut to follow the line of her waist and the sweep of her shoulders, with the unmistakable authority of a dress that knows it is beautiful and requires no one's permission to prove it. Her hair was pinned with a single silver comb, her husband's last gift, Gabriel would learn later, and the line of her neck above the neckline was enough to stop a conversation, which it did, in 3 separate corners of the room simultaneously. She was magnificent. The word arrived in Gabriel's mind without permission and settled there with the permanence of a monument. Not merely beautiful, magnificent. The beauty she had been muting for 2 years under grey wool and controlled composure was, tonight, fully deployed. Not for anyone, not for the room, for herself. She walked toward him. Her steps were measured, not counted, but measured, the difference between control and captivity. And when she reached him, she looked up into his face with an expression that made his lungs forget their function. "You shaved," she observed. "You noticed. I notice everything." She took his arm.
Her fingers settled on his sleeve with the particular weight of someone making a choice and making it publicly.
"Is he here?" "By the punch bowl." "Good."
She did not look at Braithwaite. She looked at the room, the chandeliers, the musicians tuning in the gallery, the county's best families arranged in their hierarchies of silk and self-importance. And she counted nothing. For the first time since Gabriel had known her, her lips did not move, her fingers did not tap, and her eyes did not catalogue. She was simply present, and the presence had the quality of a storm that has gathered its forces and chosen its direction. They danced. Gabriel was adequate. He had been taught at school and had practiced enough to avoid catastrophe. But Eleanor was extraordinary. She moved through the figure with the precise grace of someone whose body remembered joy even when her mind had forbidden it, and the muscle memory of happiness carried her through the steps while the room watched and wondered and whispered. "You dance like someone who used to love it," Gabriel said, turning her. "I danced with Thomas every Saturday evening in the kitchen." Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. "He was terrible. He stepped on my feet constantly." "I'm trying very hard not to." "I know." And something happened. A flash, a tremor, a crack in the composure that she did not immediately repair. Her mouth curved. Not a smile, not yet, but the precursor, the geological event that precedes the earthquake. "You're managing." The music ended. They stepped apart, and Gabriel felt the absence of her hand on his arm, like the removal of something load-bearing. Braithwaite approached. His smile was the kind that had teeth behind it, social, practiced, and entirely predatory. "Ashford." The name was pronounced the way one pronounces a debt. "And Mrs. Hale, I wasn't aware you were acquainted." "We are." Eleanor's voice carried the flat precision of a woman selecting exactly which bone to break. "The Duke has been very helpful in settling my husband's affairs." Braithwaite's smile thinned. "Affairs? Yes. Poor Thomas. Such a shock." He turned to Gabriel. "I hope you received my letter." "I did." Gabriel stepped closer. The movement placed his body between Braithwaite and Eleanor, not because she needed protecting, but because the positioning sent a message that even a man with Braithwaite's self-regard could read. "I found it clarifying." "Clarifying?" Braithwaite repeated the word as though checking it for traps. "Clarifying." Eleanor stepped around Gabriel, placing herself in Braithwaite's direct line of sight with the deliberate positioning of someone who refuses to be shielded. "As was the card room, which we opened." The color left Braithwaite's face with the speed of water leaving a cracked vessel. His composure held. He was, after all, a man who had concealed a death for 2 years. But beneath it, something buckled. The card room was sealed. It was. Eleanor's voice had not risen above conversational volume. Around them, the assembly continued. Music, laughter, the clink of glasses. But a space was forming. The particular clearing that appears in a crowd when they sense confrontation, the way animals sense weather. "I found my husband's cufflink. I found the stain on the hearth. I found the glass he was drinking from when someone pushed him." "You're making accusations. I'm stating facts." She stepped closer. The movement was small, 6 inches perhaps, but it carried the force of someone who has spent 2 years in siege and has decided to sortie. "My husband was 32 years old. He could carry our son on his shoulders for 3 miles. He did not die of apoplexy. He died on a hearthstone in a room full of men who covered it up and paid a doctor to make it disappear."
The room had gone quiet. Not silent. The musicians still played, the candles still guttered. But the conversational hum had dropped to a frequency that meant everyone was listening, or pretending not to. Braithwaite's eyes darted to Gabriel. Ashford, choose your next word very carefully. Gabriel's voice was quiet. The quiet of a large man who does not need volume to communicate threat. Because it will determine what happens next. Braithwaite swallowed. His eyes found the room, found the faces watching, found the county's collective attention focused on a conversation he could not escape without confirming every accusation by running from it. "This is not the place," he began. "No." Eleanor's composure was absolute. She did not raise her voice. She did not tremble. She stood in the middle of a ballroom, the same kind of room where she had last seen her husband alive, and she did not count a single window. The place was Ashford Park, the card room, April 27th. And you were there, Lord Brathwaite. You were there when my husband died. Mrs. Cooper was there too. She remembers. She's written it down. The name hit Brathwaite like a physical blow. Mrs. Cooper. The housemaid he'd paid to forget, whose silence he had rented, whose lease had expired. Ashford. Brathwaite's voice had lost its social register. It was raw now, urgent. The voice of a man who has run out of masks. You don't know what you're doing. I know exactly what I'm doing. Gabriel placed his hand over Eleanor's, where it rested at her side. Not a possessive gesture, a partnership. His broad palm covering her calloused fingers, his warmth meeting her composure, and the contact was visible to the room, and intended to be. I'm correcting a wrong my family committed, under my family's roof, in my house. It was an accident. The words broke from Braithwaite like water from a crack in a dam, uncontrolled, desperate, the confession that a guilty man makes when the alternative is worse. He fell. He was angry and he stood up and he fell against the hearth and it was an accident. The room heard it. The county heard it. 200 people in their best clothes, holding their punch cups and their opinions, heard Lord Brathwaite admit that Thomas Hale had not died of apoplexy, that the death certificate was a lie. But a man had fallen and died and been buried under paperwork and silence for 2 years. Eleanor's hand turned beneath Gabriel's. Her fingers found his and held, not counting, not measuring, just holding. The simple human act of reaching for another person when the ground has shifted, and you need to know that someone is standing on it with you. An accident, she repeated. Her voice carried across the silent room with the clarity of a bell. That you concealed, that you paid to hide, that you allowed me to grieve without the truth for 2 years, while my son asked why his papa went to the angels, and I had no answer that was not a lie. Brathwaite opened his mouth, closed it. The assembly watched, and the weight of their watching was a judgment more devastating than any court could deliver. I will have the truth on record, Eleanor said. I will have the death certificate corrected. I will have the land returned, which the Duke has already done. And I will have your public acknowledgement that my husband was a good man, who died because he discovered your fraud and had the courage to refuse it. Her voice did not waver. Her hand did not shake. She stood in a room full of people, beautiful in blue, holding the hand of a man whose family had wronged her, and she did not count a single thing. She did not need to. The numbers had resolved. The equation was balanced. The answer was in the room, and it was listening. Brathwaite left. He walked out of the assembly without speaking, and the crowd parted for him, with the unconscious precision of people who have identified which side of history they prefer. Gabriel turned to Eleanor. The music had stopped. The room held its breath. Her face was, he could not have described it. Not triumphant, not relieved, something older and more complex. the expression of a woman who has set down a weight she has been carrying for so long that its absence is itself a sensation, unfamiliar and overwhelming.
Eleanor. Not here.
She released his hand. The composure was returning, but different now, lighter, a garment chosen rather than armor required.
Take me home, please.
They left the assembly. The night air was warm and sweet, wild roses and the last hawthorn, grass and turned earth, and the particular clean smell of an English spring evening. The carriage was waiting. Gabriel handed her in, and she sat in the darkness of the cab, and for the first time since he had known her, she was quiet. Not counting quiet, not controlled quiet, simply quiet. The way a house is quiet after a storm has passed, and the shutters have been opened, and the rooms are filling with new air. The carriage stopped at her cottage. The windows were lit. Thomas inside, safe with the vicar's wife, probably narrating his wooden horse's evening adventures. Eleanor sat for a moment, looking at the light.
7 windows, she said. I've counted them every night for 2 years.
I know.
I counted them because I was afraid. Because if I counted them and they were all there, then the house was still standing, and Thomas was still inside and we hadn't lost anything else.
Her voice was barely above a whisper.
I don't want to count them anymore.
Gabriel reached across the darkness of the cab. His hand found hers. Calluses and cool skin, and strong fingers that had built a life from needlework and grief, and the kind of courage that doesn't announce itself. He held her hand, and she let him, and the not counting was its own kind of revolution. You don't have to.
I know.
She looked at him. In the carriage's darkness, her eyes caught the light from the cottage windows. 7 points of gold, still counted by habit, but no longer by fear.
Gabriel.
Eleanor.
I am not ready to smile.
The honesty was absolute. The steel rose stripped to its root. I am not ready to be happy. But I am, for the first time in 2 years, ready to stop being afraid. He raised her hand to his lips. The kiss was brief, his mouth against her knuckles, the roughness of her skin, the intimacy of a gesture that asked nothing and offered everything. She did not pull away. She turned her hand, and her fingers touched his jaw. A moment of contact that was tender and deliberate, and devastating in its simplicity.
Come inside, she said. Thomas will want to show you what he built today. He's been talking about it all week.
Gabriel followed her into the cottage, and Thomas was there, pink-cheeked and delighted, and holding up an elaborate construction of sticks and stones that he had built in the garden and transported inside with the determined logistics of a military campaign. The wooden horse stood at the center of the construction, which Thomas identified as a castle for brave horses.
It has 7 towers,
Thomas informed Gabriel.
1 for each window.
Eleanor's breath caught. She looked at her son, this boy who had counted his mother's fears without knowing what they were, and had built them into towers and called them brave. And something happened, something that started in the corners of her mouth and traveled to her eyes and transformed her face from beautiful composure to something beyond beauty, something alive and aching and exactly as devastating as Gabriel had imagined it would be. She smiled. Not the ghost of a smile, not the controlled flicker she had allowed in the garden, quickly captured and filed. A real smile. The kind that rearranges a face and reveals the person who has been hiding behind it. Her eyes creased. Her lips parted. The expression was rusty and unpracticed, and it wobbled slightly, like a fawn taking its first steps. And it was the most extraordinary thing Gabriel had ever seen. Thomas looked up.
Mama? It's beautiful, darling.
Her voice cracked on the word beautiful. She knelt and pulled her son against her, and the smile pressed into his dark curls where only he could feel it, and her shoulders shook once, just once, with the particular tremor of a woman releasing something she has been holding for 2 years. Gabriel stood in the cottage doorway, watching them. The wooden horse presided over its castle of 7 towers. The evening light through the 7 windows made patterns on the stone floor. The hawthorn outside was fading, its last flowers carrying the scent of a season that had changed everything. And inside this small, warm room, a woman was smiling, and a boy was laughing, and a man was understanding, with the clarity of total certainty, that this was the life he wanted. Not the title, not the house, not the library full of books. This. Exactly this. 2 weeks later, on an evening when the hawthorn had given way to wild roses and the library at Ashford Park was warm and bright and smelled of beeswax candles and the particular sweet ink Eleanor used for her ledger work, Gabriel asked. Not on his knees. He was sitting in the green chair that had become his, across from her green chair that had become hers, with Thomas asleep on the library sofa under a blanket, the wooden horse tucked under his arm, and the evening pouring through the open windows like something liquid and golden. Eleanor spoke before he had finished the sentence. She had conditions, she said. Gabriel stopped mid-word and pointed out that he had not actually asked yet. She set down her needlework, the final cushion cover, the 7th, an addition to the original 6, made from the leftover damask without being asked, and told him he had been asking for 3 weeks. He asked every time he opened a shutter, every time he repaired a fence, every time he let Thomas play in the garden and remembered to send word. She knew what he was going to say. She had conditions. She laid them out with the same precision she brought to ledger work and needlework, and grief. The cottage stayed hers. Whatever happened, wherever they lived, it and the land would be in her name, and Thomas would inherit them directly. Gabriel agreed without hesitation. She would manage the household accounts, all of them, because his uncle's finances had been a disaster, and no one with any competence had been allowed near the books. Gabriel told her he would have insisted on this himself. And Thomas. Her voice changed here, softer and fiercer simultaneously, the frequency reserved for the one thing that overrode all her composure. Thomas would choose his own life, not the church, not the military, not the law. Whatever he wanted. Gabriel echoed the words back to her, whatever he wanted. She looked at him. The assessment was thorough, unhurried, and for the first time, it contained no suspicion. She was not looking for a lie. She was looking at a man who had dismantled his own family's crime to give her the truth, who had returned stolen land without conditions, who had stood between her and a ballroom full of whispers and chosen her side without hesitation. She had one more condition, she told him. He said to name it. Ask me properly. Gabriel leaned forward. His hands, broad, calloused from the estate work he insisted on doing himself, large enough to engulf hers, rested on his knees. The library was quiet, except for Thomas's breathing and the crackle of the fire and the evening birdsong through the open window. Eleanor Hale, I am not asking you to be the Duchess of Ashford. I am not asking you to fix my house, or manage my debts, or redeem my family's name. I am asking you, specifically, only, entirely you, to let me be the man who makes you tea in the morning, and argues about rose pruning, and listens to Thomas explain the geopolitical situation of his wooden horse kingdom. He paused. I love you. I have loved you since you told me my fences were in disrepair. I will love you regardless of your answer, but I am hoping, very much, that you will say yes. She did not say yes immediately. She counted, and then stopped, caught herself, smiled at the catching, a small, private expression that was funnier than she would have admitted. Yes, she said. With conditions noted. Conditions noted. She held out her hand, the handshake, their third, their commerce, their contract, their language, and Gabriel took it, and held it, and then pulled gently, so that she came forward from her chair, and he stood to meet her, and they were standing in the library, very close, in the warm light. And when he kissed her, it was not the literary kiss of a story. It was the real kiss of two people who had earned it, whose mouths knew each other's names, and whose hands knew each other's calluses, and whose bodies recognized, with the simple certainty of a lock meeting its key, that this was where they had been heading since a boy tugged a coat in a village square and stated the problem that had brought them here. Thomas stirred on the sofa. "Are you kissing?" They separated. Gabriel's ears turned red. Eleanor's composure, for once, was entirely absent, replaced by an expression that could only be described as flustered, which looked so unexpected on her controlled features that Gabriel laughed, and the laughter broke something open in the room. A final seal, a last door, the wall behind which joy had been locked for 2 years. "Go to sleep, Thomas," Eleanor said, with precisely zero authority. "I knew it." Thomas pulled the blanket over his head, but his voice carried, muffled and smug. "The wooden horse said so." The summer came. The hawthorn faded, and the roses took over, climbing the cottage walls, arching over the garden gate, filling the Ashford Park library with fragrance through windows that were never closed. The library was unrecognizable now. The dust was gone. The shutters were permanently open. The green chairs were joined by a small chair that Thomas had claimed as his own, and the desk held Eleanor's ledgers alongside Gabriel's correspondence and Thomas's drawings, which depicted a range of subjects, including, but not limited to, horses, castles, fish from the pond, and what Thomas described as the Duke making faces at breakfast. Eleanor managed the estate accounts with the ruthless efficiency of someone who had kept a household alive on needlework for 2 years, and understood the value of every penny with a precision that made the previous steward weep with professional shame. She did not count windows anymore. She counted other things: rose blooms, account entries, the days until the drainage ditch was finally completed. But the counting had changed. It was no longer a wall. It was a tool. Thomas rode on Gabriel's shoulders through the garden, pointing at birds and narrating elaborate adventures for his wooden horse, which now lived on the library mantelpiece between a first edition of Fielding and a pot of Eleanor's ink. The paint was almost entirely worn away now, the carving smoothed by years of a child's devotion, and in the summer light it had the quality of a talisman that has fulfilled its purpose and can finally rest. On a warm evening in July, when the wild roses were heavy with bloom, and the air smelled of cut grass and honey, and the particular sweetness of a season that has decided to be generous, Eleanor sat in her green chair in the library that had once been cold and was now the warmest room in the house, and she looked up from her needlework, a christening gown, this one for herself, for news that was still a secret between her and Gabriel and the midwife. And she smiled. Not the smile of the assembly, fierce and hard-won, not the smile of the cottage, cracked and trembling and new. This was the smile of a woman who had passed through grief and come out the other side and found, waiting for her, a life she had not been counting on. A warm room, an open window, a man who had dismantled his own family's lie to give her the truth. A boy on the library floor, galloping a worn wooden horse across the carpet, making sounds of thunder and joy. Thomas looked up. "Mama's smiling again," he told the horse. "Yes," Eleanor said. "She is." "If you stayed until the end, I want you to know, the hours you spend here mean everything. I'd love to know, was there a moment that caught you? A line that landed? Tell me in the comments. And if this is your first time here, come sit by the fire, subscribe, and I'll have another story waiting for you soon."